For 20 years now, we've been trying to get access to Mr. James Santos, aka Otis Jackson. For 20 years, he has confessed to the crime that my father has served 20 years for. For 20 years, he hasn't wavered in his testimony. We've had the documents. We've just never been able to hear his voice or see his face as he tells us that he's the man who committed this crime. Until now.
Mr. Santos, can you please state and spell both your first and last name for the court reporter?
Yes, sir. James Santos, Jamessantos.
One of the main reasons why you've never heard from Mr. Santos or he didn't testify in our original case is because he's been painted as delusional or mentally incompetent, but that's just not the case. Mr. Santos is well within his wits. In fact, he's intelligent, but you don't have to take my word for it. He was actually evaluated and cleared by a clinical psychologist in 2017 before being allowed to testify in another unrelated murder trial.
Mr. Santos, can you take a look at that report and see if you recognize that to be the report that was completed following Dr. Hudson's mental health evaluation of you in 2017?
Yes, sir.
Does it appear to be a fair, true, and accurate depiction of that report?
Yes, sir.
At this time, I'd request to move into evidence what's been marked as defense 28 and 28.
Mr. Minor said there was no objection.
That is correct, Your Honor. I'd like clarification about the dates of this one. It said August 2017. Clarification that it predates.
Yes, sir. So for clarification, Mr. Santos, it looks like the evaluation was done on July 31st. The date of the report is August 1st, 2017. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
28, defense exhibit 28 will be admitted.
Mr. Santos, based on his evaluation, did Dr. Hudson ultimately opine that you demonstrated a factual and rational appreciation of the legal process with no evidence of a mental illness or intellectual deficit, further finding that you have an agenda for providing testimony which is consistent with your philosophies, lifestyle, and life history? Is that all correct?
Yes, sir.
Crazy what you can find out when you ask an expert. What's also interesting is that though the description given by the victims was not accurate in describing Imam Jamil Al-Amin, it did describe someone else. The primary descriptors being 5'8", 5'9", with cold gray eyes. Now, I don't know if Mr. Santos has cold gray eyes, but I wonder how tall he is.
How tall are you?
5'8".
Another element of the description given was that the shooter was wounded. My father was not wounded, and other officers attested to the fact that the victims were indeed marksmen. So if they said they wounded the shooter was wounded. However, Mr. Santos was wounded. But I'm not going to play a short clip of him saying he was wounded. From this point forward, I'll just play his entire testimony about that night, followed by a reading of the written confessions he's provided in the past.
From October of 13th of 1997 until December 22nd of 2000, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Do those dates again, please.
Yes, sir. October 13th, 1997 to December 22nd of 2000.
Yes, sir.
All right. Isn't it true that during that incarceration you contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigations and told them that you had committed a murder and were involved in the shooting of a cop in March of 2000 in Atlanta, Georgia?
Yes.
You did?
Yes.
All right. And you couldn't have because you were in prison in Nevada, right?
No, sir. I got out of prison in 2000 in February. I was on house arrest when the murder took place. You might want to check that out. I was on house arrest. I was staying at 2380 Jernigan Street, Southwest Atlanta.
You just said that you were incarcerated in Las Vegas in 1997 through December of 2000.
I went back to prison after that shooting. I was violated and sent back to prison after the police shooting. That's why it says BP by my name. That's parole violation. If you look at the photo, it says BP beside my number. That means parole violation.
You violated your probation because you went back to prison.
Exactly. I violated after the shooting.
You were interviewed by the Federal Bureau of Investigations for that out there in that Nevada prison, were you not, in July
Yes, sir.
of that year?
Yes, sir.
And he ruled you out and said you did not commit that murder in Las Vegas, correct?
I don't know what
that murder in Atlanta.
I have no idea what his conclusion was, sir.
All right, you weren't arrested for it, were you?
No, sir, I was not.
In fact, another person was tried and convicted.
Jamil Al-Amin, yes, sir.
Yes, sir. And once again, it seems to me like you were getting a lot of
I was shot that day.
I'm sorry?
I was shot March of 2000. It happened March 17th of 2000.
Your Honor, we can take a break right now. Come back.
Okay. All right, we'll take a 10 minutes.
After that, I'd probably need a break too, because that was information that was never supposed to make it into the record. As you can see, they try to discredit him at every turn, but it's not possible. He was there. He was out of prison. He was living in Atlanta. And most importantly, he was wounded in the commission of this crime. So now we have a man who has confessed to the crime, who fits the description of the crime, who was in the area during the commission of the crime, who was shot during the commission of the crime. What more do we need, at least, to look at the case again? He didn't testify in the first case. If you think he's crazy, put him on the stand. Prove it. But this is the man who committed the murder that my father served 20 years for. This is the man who was also willing and able to take responsibility for that still to this day. So if nothing else, we deserve a new trial just based on this. But as you've seen, we have plenty of reasons for it. So if you were on the fence, please sign the petition. Please share the petition. We have to let the Conviction Integrity Unit, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office, and Mr. Paul Howard know that we're paying attention and we demand fairness and justice in this matter. As always, it's free Imam Jamil, and I'm going to leave you with a reading of an article about the confessions, which will give you some more detailed insight into what he's been saying for the last 20 years. This man deserves to be heard. He just doesn't want the Imam to be taking the fall for a murder that he committed. It's that simple. Otis Jackson is a self-proclaimed leader of the almighty Vice Lords Nation. Founded in the late 1950s, the AVLN is one of the oldest street gangs in Chicago. According to Jackson, the group under his leadership was focused on rebuilding communities by pushing out drug dealers and violence. In a never-before-published sworn deposition, Jackson recalls the events of the night of Thursday, March 16, 2000 in vivid detail. It was a cool night, as Jackson remembers. He wore a knee-high black Islamic thobe with black pants, a black kufi, Muslim head covering, underneath a tan hat, and a tan leather jacket. His silver sunglasses with yellow tint sat above his full beard and mustache. He arrived at Mick's around 7 p.m. when he realized his schedule had changed. He was no longer the food expediter in the kitchen. His title was now dishwasher cook, which meant he would wash dishes and then help close the kitchen at night. Since his title changed, he wasn't required to work that Thursday night. It immediately dawned on him that he had a 10-hour window to do whatever he wanted. As a parolee under house arrest, the opportunity to have truly free time was rare if it ever even existed. Jackson decided to fill his newfound freedom like most people fill their free time. He ran a few errands. His first stop was the West End Mall, where he got a bite to eat, did some shopping, and then headed toward the West End Community Mosque, led by Al-Amin. He knew it was a regular building off of Oak Street, but wasn't sure which one exactly. He parked his black Cadillac in an open field and walked down toward a house that turned out to be the mosque. He passed the black Mercedes before he got to the mosque, where he met a man named Lamar Mustafa Tanner. They talked for a while, during which Jackson explained to Tanner that he was looking for Al-Amin to talk about how the AVLN could help Al-Amin's community. Tanner told Jackson to check the grocery store, since Al-Amin could usually be found there. Tanner then gave Jackson his phone number and hurried away to go pick up his wife. Jackson proceeded to the grocery store. He wanted to discuss with Al-Amin how his AVLN group could help further clean the streets of drug dealers in the West End community. By the time Jackson made his way to Al-Amin's store, it was already late. He was afraid the store would be closed since he didn't see anyone else on the street. His fear was affirmed. The store wasn't open. Hoping that maybe the owner would be in the back closing up, he knocked on the door a few more times. No answer. As he turned to leave, Jackson saw a patrol car pull up. By the time Jackson walked by the black Mercedes, the patrol car was parked in front of it, nose to nose. The driver of the patrol car got out and asked Jackson to put his hands up. Immediately, the scenario flashed through Jackson's head. Here he was, violating his parole by not being at work with a 9mm handgun in his waist. Jackson was afraid the cops would think he was breaking into the store. That meant they would probably frisk him and find the gun. The gun would be a direct violation of his parole, and he'd be sent back to prison in Nevada. Jackson ignored the order to put his hands up and instead began to explain that he was not trying to break into the store. He stated that he wasn't trying to steal the Mercedes either. His car was parked down the street. Both officers were out of the car with guns drawn and demanding Jackson put his hands up. The cops were closing in, and there was little space between them. Jackson made a quick decision. He backed up against the Mercedes, pulled out his gun, and began to fire. He fired off 2 shots. The officers, while retreating, returned fire. Jackson wasn't hit and bolted toward his car, where in the trunk he had an arsenal of other weapons. As Jackson explained, the organization I was about to form, the Almighty Vice Lord Nation, were anti-oppression, and we fight, drug dealers and whatnot, so we need artillery. He quickly opened the trunk. The lock was broken and held together with shoestring, and grabbed a lightweight semi-automatic carbine Ruger Mini 14 with an extended clip housing 40 .223 caliber rounds. Jackson then headed back toward the cops. One was moving for cover behind the Mercedes, the other on the police radio screaming for backup. Jackson approached the officer he thought was the most aggressive, who was using the Mercedes for cover, and resumed firing his rifle. The officer returned fire, hitting Jackson in the upper left arm twice. Jackson, now angered and fearful for his life, shot back, downing the officer. Jackson stood over him and shot him in the groin up to 4 times. The fallen officer, Deputy Kinchin, in a last attempt to plead with his killer, described his family, mother, and children to Jackson, hoping for mercy. But Jackson admits that by this time, my mind was gone, so I really wasn't paying attention. Jackson fired again at the officer on the ground, dripping his own blood on the concrete where he stood. Jackson then turned his attention to Deputy English, who was running toward the open field. Jackson believed English was flagging down another officer. He couldn't let him get away. Jackson hit English 4 times. 1 shot hit him in the leg. He soon fell, screaming, thereby confirming Jackson's shot. After English went down, Jackson, in a state of shock, walked down past the mosque. Nursing his bleeding wounds, he tried to stop 3 passing cars on the road. No one dared to pull over. He then walked back down the street and knocked on 3 different doors for assistance. Only one even turned the light on, but no one opened the door for Jackson. He then made his way back to his car and drove to his mother's home. As he walked in the door, the phone rang. His mother was asleep, so Jackson hurriedly answered it in the other room. It was a representative from the Sentinel company that provided the monitoring service for Jackson's ankle bracelet. The man on the phone asked where Jackson was. He responded that he was at work. The Sentinel representative explained that his unaccounted for absence would have to be marked down as a violation. Jackson agreed and quickly ended the conversation. Although 1 bullet exited through the back of his arm, the other was still lodged in his upper left arm. Jackson called a couple of female friends who were registered nurses. The women, who were informed by Jackson that he was robbed in the middle of the night, arrived at his house and worked for 3 hours to remove the bullet from his arm. Jackson then called Mustafa Tanner, whom he had met earlier in the evening, and asked him to come by his house. Tanner arrived before 10 a.m. Jackson explained what had happened the previous night and said he needed to get rid of the guns and the car. Jackson's car trunk contained enough artillery for a mini militia: 3 Ruger Mini 14 rifles, an M16 assault rifle, a .45 handgun, 3 9mm handguns, and a couple of shotguns. Once Tanner left, Jackson called his parole officer, Sarah Bacon, and let her know that he had been involved in the situation, but left out the details. In the following days, Jackson was asked to report to the Sentinel company. He checked in with the monitoring company and his parole officer and was then given a ride back home. As they pulled onto his street, Jackson noticed many unmarked police cars. After entering his driveway, multiple police officers emerged. The police searched Jackson's house and found rounds of Mini 14, .223, 9mm, and M16 ammunition. Jackson's bloody clothes and boots from the shootout with the deputies the night before were left untouched in his closet. On March 28, 2000, Jackson's parole was revoked and he was sent back to prison to serve the remainder of his sentence in Nevada. Upon his detainment in Florida and later transfer to Nevada, Jackson confessed the crime to anyone who would listen. Jackson claims that when he reached the Clark County Jail in Las Vegas, Nevada, he made numerous phone calls to the FBI, after which an agent arrived to discuss the incident with him. Jackson recalls telling his story to Special Agent Mahoney. Special Agent Devin Mahoney recalls documenting the confession, but not much beyond that. Mahoney remembers getting a call from a superior to talk to someone in Las Vegas jail and then to document it and file it up the chain of command. The confession was documented and filed on June 29th, 2000. And that's the last time anybody heard of it. Sign the petition, share the petition, free Imam Jamil.